it back, shift my gears, back on track for some years. Now I'm high, ain't no low, my third eye, it don't close. Now I'm high, ain't no low, my third eye, it don't close. You ain't ready for it, nah, 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 nah. You ain't ready for it, nah, 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 nah. You ain't ready for it, nah, 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 nah.
So, pagans. A lot of them are white. Like, a lot of them. Which is fine. But why?
Oh my god, Karen, you can't just ask people why they're white.
Okay, for real though. It isn't really a secret that a lot of white women and queer white people are pretty active in witchcraft and pagan spaces. I mean, have you seen our deities? And while we can definitely improve and work on things within the pagan and witchcraft communities to make these spaces better, the main thing that I want to focus on today are Black, Brown, and Indigenous people who exist within pagan and witchcraft spaces. It isn't very often that I meet other people of color in pagan spaces, both online and especially in the real world, and I want to dissect why. This video isn't going to be about folkism or blatant white supremacist movements within paganism, though they are obviously a factor, but more of analyzing how pagans of color tend to be received even in more liberal spaces.
Dude, you gotta get out of the car. You gotta get out.
What can I do?
Swim.
What?
Swim. Swim.
What to do?
Leave the car. Swim.
Stay in the car?
Leave the car. Swim.
Before we move forward, I want to clarify some terms I'm going to be using. Throughout this video, I'm going to be describing what I call white paganism. And when I say this, I don't mean pagans who happen to be white. In this context, I'm referring to the social construct of whiteness and the systemic power it holds in our current society. Obviously, pagans who are white are the most likely to perpetuate and uphold this social construct, but people of color and other minorities are capable of upholding whiteness as well. I'll put some links in the description that go a little more in depth on this concept if you need further explanation. Actually, if you have the time, I recommend pausing the video to go check them out before going forward. Are you following me so far? Okay, cool. So, if you've been online for any stretch of time, you may have come across terms like white feminism or white leftism, usually in juxtaposition to their intersectional versions. I'm going to be doing the same thing by also talking about intersectional paganism, it being the opposite of white paganism in that it recognizes identities and issues outside the realms of the white default. Think of it kind of like monotheism versus polytheism. Whiteness only recognizes one type of person, while intersectionality recognizes many. Now, I can already see somebody coming at me like,
paganism is a religion. Why are you turning it political?
Or,
the gods don't care about politics.
Yada yada yada. And listen, if I didn't have to think about the social, economic, or political systems of this world and how they affect me ever again, I would be over the moon. But this is the real world, and in the real world, people like me are deemed political just for existing. Also, I want to give a quick disclaimer. I'm obviously just one person with one perspective, and even though I'm going to be coming at this primarily from a native perspective, I can't speak for all indigenous people, and I definitely can't speak for all people of color. And because of my singular perspective, I'm sure there will be things that I miss or wouldn't think of. So, let's talk about white paganism. Even if the person is generally progressive or inclusive, it's still possible to fall into unconscious biases. Again, someone doesn't have to be a folkist or blatant racist to do these things, but they can still make people of color in the community uncomfortable. So this one might be surprising since it seems like something a folkist would do, but again, this can happen even in progressive spaces. An example would be like assuming a black or Asian person wouldn't be interested in heathenry, or assuming an indigenous person like myself wouldn't engage with deities outside of my culture, or assuming that just because someone is black, brown, or indigenous, that they know everything about their traditional religions. In her book, Bringing Race to the Table, Exploring Racism in the Pagan Community, Crystal Blanton wrote, "People of color often are put in positions within the modern pagan community to speak on behalf of their minority ethnic group, becoming the unofficial ambassador for the community to connect with those of other races. Assumptions and questions about differences in our cultural makeup can serve to further marginalize people of color, especially when there are only one or two present. The fundamental assumption that we are attempting to integrate into a community that is not ours is the root of all these microaggressions." I personally have felt this pretty hardcore while in majority white pagan spaces. Hell, even with my own YouTube channel. I don't want to be spokesperson, ambassador, whatever the fuck. There's no way I'm qualified enough for that. I just want to vibe and share a common love for the gods, man. But it's hard to do that when I feel like I need to be ready to correct misinformation or deal with microaggressions at a moment's notice. And that leads me to asking for emotional labor. And yes, I know emotional labor means like being forced to smile while doing retail or some shit, but I'm using it in this context because this is basically just unpaid labor. You all know what I mean. So this problem isn't specific to pagan spaces, but it's still worth addressing. In most cases, people of color are going to be the minority in a pagan space, which means a lot of the white people might go to them and ask them to explain certain things, or even just try to get their opinion on highly charged topics. And I get where this is coming from, and I'm not saying that you should never do that or never ask questions, but when you get asked to explain something for like the 100th time, especially if it's something traumatic like residential schools or an individual's general experience with racism, it gets very, very exhausting, and it's easy to burn out and just not want to engage anymore. I know everyone hates the
Google is free
comment, and I also know that Google isn't exactly going to give you the right answers all the time, but it does help a lot if you're able to do at least some basic research before asking for the history of everything.
Q&A, what's the history of the world?
So, lately a lot of inclusive pagan spaces have actually been doing a lot better at this, especially when it comes to using white sage or certain aesthetics from native culture. If you want a little more info on that, I recommend my allyship video, which I will link in the description, but there are still a few things I see that don't get addressed as often. An example of something that I still see a lot is white pagans, especially if they do spirit work, calling themselves shamans, or even still referring to indigenous medicine people as shamans. Europeans first adopted this word after encountering indigenous Siberians and eventually started applying it to all indigenous people. We obviously have our own words and our own languages for our healers and medicine people, but if you don't know those names, medicine person or medicine people is usually fine. And if you're not an actual indigenous medicine person, please don't call yourself that, or a shaman. It just makes you look like a scam artist and is just disrespectful. And now this next bit probably won't be very popular, but I honestly don't understand why a lot of white pagans understand cultural appropriation when it comes to indigenous people in America and Canada, but won't really question it when a white person adopts, quote, Aztec polytheism or some other South American indigenous practice. Like, why does it being south of the border suddenly make it okay? And look, I am not from any of those cultures. Both sides of my family come from 2 different California tribes. And I don't know what their opinions are or how they handle stuff like this, but I do know that these people still exist and they still practice variations of their traditional beliefs. At the very least, I think it's something the pagan community needs to have a conversation about. I'm definitely not the right person to lead that conversation, but it's something that we definitely should consider. These are just a few examples. There's a lot more that I could probably share, but I don't want this video to be like 3 hours long. If you're a person of color in pagan spaces, I would love to hear any of your thoughts or concerns regarding this topic, so let me know in the comments. It's important to fight against folkists, Nazis, and white supremacists. They are a huge threat in the pagan spaces and need to get the fuck out. And anyone doing the work to combat them is doing a hard and unfortunately necessary job. I also just think it's good that we check in with ourselves and the people that we're fighting for. I think for a lot of white pagans, it's easy to get tunnel vision because, honestly, if you don't fit perfectly into this white, cis-het Christian box, you're gonna run into people who want to start shit and question why you're going down a different path. And I don't want to downplay the religious trauma that a lot of pagans, white or not, have gone through. The way Christian supremacy affects all people is important to discuss. But I also want white pagans to be mindful and remember that they're not the only ones in this space, and any issues they face aren't the end-all be-all of discrimination, and that often they can perpetuate racism and religious discrimination against others in the same spaces as them, even if it is unintentional, because if our paganism can't be intersectional, we're not making any meaningful progress. I hope you all enjoyed this video. It's been a while since I've been able to make one. This took me kind of a while to figure out my new look and editing and what to write about, and I'm very tired. I'm gonna sleep. But yeah, if you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time.
Turn it back, shift my gears, back on track for some years. Now I'm high, ain't no love out there now. It don't close, now I'm high.